Let there be light. Okay, tonight's lesson we're going to be discussing evolution. There's a few things I'd like to bring up before we get started. It's important to know that this talk on evolution really doesn't have anything to do with whether God exists and Christianity is true. So we have to be careful with our kids and stuff that we don't make the evolution debate about salvation, because ultimately evolution, I don't believe macroevolution is true, don't get me wrong. But evolution could be true, and Jesus can still be God and have been resurrected from the dead. Now, if you believe in evolution, you have some problems with biblical inerrancy. It does cause some problems there. But Christianity can ultimately still be true. And we need to understand that there are good Christians, brothers in Christ, who love the Lord, and they believe in evolution. I don't understand it, but they're smart people. It's not like they're dummies. But we have to understand that we have to be brothers in Christ, and we can disagree and have that conversation. The wonderful thing is that is happening, because BioLogos is an organization, Christian organization, and they're theistic evolutionists, meaning they believe in evolution. They don't believe it's unguided like scientists do. They believe that God guided it along the way. And they have conversation with Hugh Ross's organization, which is Reasons to Believe. And they are old earth creationists. They believe in special creation of all the animals in Adam and Eve. They just believe that the earth is old. And then we have young earth creationism, which is Ken Ham's organization. And they believe the earth is approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And they also believe in special creation. So we just have to keep in mind that we can be brothers in Christ and just have that conversation. And it's actually like age of the earth and stuff, in my opinion, that should be a conversation inside the church, because I don't think it's good for the world to constantly see that Christians are always disagreeing on everything. So with that said, we will move on. Who's ever heard of Piltdown Man? Anybody remember hearing about that in their high school textbooks and biology classes? Piltdown Man was a 1912 discovery in Piltdown, England. Did I leave my glasses back there? So not only do I not have notes, I can't even read the screen. Get it together, man. So it was a discovery in Piltdown, England, hence the name Piltdown Man. And the British Museum reconstructed fragments of a skull and a jawbone, and they had hailed it as a link, or the missing link, between ape and man. Later, it was found out to be a hoax in 1923. In fact, it was a combination of a human skull, orangutan jaw, and chimpanzee teeth. But here's what's interesting. The scientific community did not concede that it was a hoax for 30 years. So why did it take them 30 years to say, yep, this is incorrect, it's a hoax, and pull it from textbooks and do all that stuff? Is it possible that people are just seeing what they want to see? And when I say that, it's important that we as Christians also be aware that we can have blinders. You know, we have pet doctrines that we hold on to. I mean, a lot of us came from law and moved into grace. And we thought law was the way you served God. So we had blinders, and we had to be willing to hear a message that was contrary to what we believed before God could move us along the path of revelation and reveal that to our hearts. So it's very possible that people can see what they want to see based on their worldview presuppositions. And the gentleman on the screen is Anthony Flew. He was probably one of the greatest philosophical atheists of our time. He's since passed away, unfortunately. But he always made a commitment in his scientific quest to always follow the evidence where it led. And he was committed to that. And the evidence did eventually lead him to belief in God. Now, he came public, he made it public, but he was more of a deist rather than a theist like we would be. And a deist is more of the idea of a God that's not involved. He wound the clock at the beginning of time, and now it just runs. So he doesn't continue to participate in the natural world. He just wound up the clock. Now, whether he actually became a Christian at some point, we do not know. Hopefully he did. Now, who remembers the O.J. Simpson trial? Everybody remembers the TV, and we were glued to the TV to watch a white Bronco drive 35 mile an hour down interstate. And I don't know how many hours we watched that. But in the trial, this was the evidence. Simpson's blood was at the scene, and there's only a 1 in 170 million chance that it wasn't his blood. Goldman, Brown, and Simpson's blood was in Simpson's Bronco. Now, some of you might be too young to remember this, but Simpson was accused of killing his ex-wife, Nicole Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Brown? Rob? Okay. Or Goldman, excuse me. And so all three of their blood was in Simpson's Bronco. The glove at the scene had blood from all three of them, and it matched a glove that was found at Simpson's house. There were bloody footprints at the scene from a rare brand of size 12 shoe that Simpson owned. And Brown's blood on Simpson's socks. And it's a 1 in 21 billion chance that it wasn't her blood. Now, this is the evidence. Does that evidence tell you whether he was guilty or not?
No, but it sure points a good hard finger.
But the evidence itself doesn't tell you anything. You have to interpret the evidence and come to a conclusion. Now, 10 years later, NBC did a survey of roughly 1,200 people, and they found that 77% of people believed Simpson was guilty. Now, he was actually acquitted. A year or two later, he was tried in a civil case and found guilty. But the original trial, he was acquitted of all charges. But 77% of people believe he was guilty. But there was a disparity in those results. There was a huge ethnic divide, because 87% of whites believed he was guilty, but only 27% of blacks believed he was guilty. Now, this is not making any racial arguments one way or the other. It's just saying, is it possible that people just see what they want to see? Again, we have to follow the evidence where it leads. And then who's seen this graph? If you've ever looked into climate change or global warming, you've probably seen this graph. They call it the hockey stick graph. And I think it was in 2004, I don't remember, but you can see the hockey stick shape, that temperatures, when they look at the temperatures from years past, which is the blue line, they get that from ice cores and tree rings. And it shows kind of a level, if not a little bit of a decreasing temperature. And then all of a sudden we get this hockey stick. But it was determined that this graph was, again, not a hoax necessarily, but it was incorrect. It was a false graph. And they found out that the person that put the graph together was cherry picking his data. They called it a trick to hide an actual decline, that during that same time period they said temperatures were actually declining a little bit. They used a defective algorithm. He was hiding data. And if you dissented to the status quo, you were blacklisted. That sounds a little bit similar to what's happening with the evolution debate in academia. If you dissent to the fact of evolution, you are blacklisted. Again, is it possible that people are just seeing what they want to see? We used this example last week. This is our friendly amoeba again. And it doesn't say whether it was made by God or made by natural forces. You have to look at the evidence and determine what the evidence is. You have to interpret the evidence and interpret what it's showing you. When it comes to evolution, there's a lot of big names and things they use, punctuated equilibrium and all that stuff. But you can boil down all those arguments for evolution into basically two arguments. The first argument is small adaptations lead to new species. And that's taking the idea of microevolution and extrapolating that to macroevolution. For those of you who weren't here last week, the difference between the two, microevolution is observable. Microevolution is just small changes within a species. So you can see that if you look up the peppered moth, you can see that the moth, I don't know what city they did this study in, but you can see that the moth changed color over time. And it was based on pollution levels. So as pollution increased and the smog increased in the city, the moths became grayer. Instead of being almost white, they turned gray over time. Now, macroevolution is what science wants you to believe, that because we see these small changes within species, we believe that those small changes lead to huge changes across species over millions of years. The second argument they have is similarities in structure, which they call homology, homologous structures, and the DNA, which we talked about DNA. And they say that those two are evidence of a common ancestor, that we are all related to everything else that is living in existence, whether it's a shark, a plant, a platypus, which is a really interesting creature. First, we're going to talk about small adaptations leading to new species. In 2004, National Geographic, they came out with an article, and it was called, "Was Darwin Wrong?" Now, what do you think their answer was? They believe that Darwin was right. And their one piece of evidence that they hammered on in this article was this guy. He's kind of cute, I guess, if you're into bulldogs and pugs. But they used dog breeding as an example. And what they said is, we can see evolution take place because for years we've been breeding dogs, and we can breed dogs to get dogs as small as these little teacup pups that sit in a coffee mug, all the way to the Great Dane, which we saw a friend of ours that had two or three Great Danes, and those things would come up and they would be like right here in your face. Those animals are huge. So we get a lot of variety by breeding. What they didn't understand they were doing is, I think, what Linda brought up, or somebody did. Maybe it was Renee. They forget that dog breeding requires intelligence. Dog breeders have a purpose and a goal. They know what they're trying to get at, and then they manipulate the species to get what they want. But the article said dog breeding is an example of evolution, and when they say evolution, they mean macroevolution. Breeding in a short time gives you different dogs, so natural selection acting on random mutations over a long period of time will give you different species. But what's the problem? What do we always get when we breed dogs? We get dogs. We don't get antelope. We don't get platypi. What's the plural of platypus? Platypi. So we don't ever change species. And if intelligent breeding, using all of our intelligence that we can muster from some of the best scientific minds around, if we can't exceed genetic limits, why would we think a non-intelligent process that is just random, acting on random mutations, there's no purpose or goal with the evolutionary process, barring God. It's just random. There's no source or force, I guess, in Star Wars. There's no force out there that's guiding this process. There's just mutations and nature acting on those mutations, and whatever is the fittest survives. In fact, Richard Lenski from Michigan State University, he's been doing studies with E. coli bacteria for probably around 30 years now. And what's great about E. coli, for our position, what's great about E. coli bacteria is they replicate very fast. So we can get a lot of generations of mutations in a very short period of time. In fact, about 30 years of E. coli replicating would equate to about 1 million years of human evolution. And guess what Lenski's still getting in his petri dishes? He still has bacteria. There's changes in the bacteria, but there's still bacteria. So macroevolution is not something that's ever been observed. So microevolution within types, yes, we can agree with that and have no problems. Macroevolution across types, we say no. Now, we brought up Darwin's finches previously, and this is an argument against macroevolution, his own finches, which he used for an argument for macroevolution. But what we saw with Darwin's finches, and if you don't remember, when he was studying the finches, he noticed that the width of the beak basically got bigger in dry seasons when they had drought, and the beak got smaller in wet seasons. And that was because they're ground finches, and they were competing for seeds. And since there was a low supply in drought seasons, the birds with the larger beaks were able to break the harder and bigger seeds. So they prospered. But it's not directional. The big beaks to small beak proportion of finches is not directional to a specific goal. It fluctuates. So in the dry years, your proportion of large beak finches was greater than the small beak finches, but it would turn around and go the other way in wet years. So it wasn't like this long, continuous process of necessarily improvement in finches. It was cyclical. So you start with finches, you end with finches, but what they never tell you is, where did the finches come from? All evolution can tell you is the fittest survive, but they have no idea how these novel features show up in the first place. They have no chemical or biological explanation for how we got the new characteristics that nature could then select. They call it selection, but nobody's selecting. So they're not telling us where these guys came from. There's a lot of variation between those three birds, and yet they're still birds. So they can't make that leap. At least they don't have the evidence to make that leap. They use a lot of stories and of how we might have got there. If you go out, you can see Richard Dawkins do this wonderful. It's actually seems very convincing, because he has this whole thing that they show kids. Their goal is to go after our kids, and they show how the evolution of the human eye could have occurred. And they start with the eye spot, which couldn't see, all it could see was light coming into it. And then it showed how you could have cupping around that eye spot, and then the organism would know which direction the light was coming from. So then they could move in the direction of the light. And then as you got more cupping, you could even see things reflected on the retina. So he goes through this 15-minute thing that it's like, wow, that sounds really good. The problem is they don't explain all the protein changes at the microscopic level that have to happen to get cupping. And they have no methodology of how that occurred. They don't know. All they do is they just say, hey, we can see how this would have happened, and then this would have happened, and then this would have happened. But they can't, at the biomolecular level, they have no idea what mutated and how it gave rise to this, and then this, and then this, and then this. So it's just not something that's been shown in the lab. The second argument is similarities in structure, which is homology and the DNA as an evidence for the common, our common ancestry with everything alive. And this is Richard Dawkins, who I think we've mentioned several times. Richard Dawkins is kind of our punching bag, not that we're trying to be mean, but he's not a philosopher. He's poor in philosophy. He's a good scientist, don't get me wrong. But science requires philosophy, logic, critical thinking, and he makes a lot of blunders there. But he is probably one of the most outspoken atheists, and he's an evolutionary biologist. And he said the reason we know for certain that we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. Now, this was his response to Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was a Christian attorney at University of California, Berkeley. Yeah, I said Berkeley on purpose. And he was an attorney. He wasn't a biologist. But what he noticed in Darwinists and their claim to macroevolution, what he noticed is it wasn't about the evidence. It was just a logic or an inference problem. Their inference from the evidence was incorrect. So Philip Johnson actually wrote Richard Dawkins and said, okay, cut to the chase. What is your best evidence for macroevolution? And this was the response he got. And this is where they get it. They go to our DNA and they say, look at the similarity between us and apes. And they say the DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, but it's also about 90% between mice and humans. Because of the complex way cells use genetic information, very small genetic differences can produce big functional differences. Now, it's somewhat debatable yet of whether it's actually 96%. My question is, between 96% and 100% of us and apes being alike, that 4%, There's a lot of differences. Between that 4% accounts for Beethoven, Michelangelo, all the brilliant engineers building skyscrapers that can actually move in the wind so they don't collapse. There's a huge difference between us and apes. And that came from a 4% difference in our DNA. And if it's between, we're still 90% between mice and us, now we have to explain the vast difference between us and mice, and we're only 10% apart. What Dawkins is not addressing is there are potentially two options. He's saying it has to be a natural explanation. What's the other option he's not considering? That maybe there's a common designer. And if we all exist in the same biosphere, and we all living things breathe oxygen or use oxygen and use CO2, and we all have to get around and be mobile, most living things. So if it's 96 between us and apes, why should that surprise us? We both have a skeletal system composed of bone. We all have muscles and lungs and heart. We have the same features. So if a common creator or a creator is behind it, he's creating us both to exist and be mobile in the same environment. So it can be equally explainable by a common designer. In fact, engineers do the same thing. The airplane, through its whole evolution, if we want to use that word, the airplane, they had wings at the beginning, they had rudders at the beginning, and they still have wings and rudders, and that's because they had to overcome gravity through aerodynamics. So we shouldn't be surprised that the creator used a similar blueprint. So Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. We have Chris's favorite, the bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, the peacock, the porcupine, the human. According to Darwinists, you are related to the mildew on your shower curtain. That's hard for me to wrap my head around. Now, we go back to Dawkins' quote in his response to Johnson, and he said, the reason we know for certain, macroevolution, they hammer, you'll hear it that it's settled fact, which scientists aren't supposed to ever say that a theory or something is settled fact, but they will hem-haw around that and they'll say it's as close to settled fact as anything in science. So Richard Dawkins knows for certain we're all related, but to continue his quote, he has a moment of honesty, and this is very telling. He says, my philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true. So why do you think he comes to the conclusion that nature can explain all the vast differences in life? It's because he's already ruled out anything other than his commitment to materialism and reductionism. He will never come to another conclusion as long as he's ruling out any intelligence beforehand. And that's just poor science. The other thing is, when you rule out intelligence at the beginning, that's a circular argument, and we'll explain that a little later. He's assuming what he's trying to prove, which just means it's a worthless argument if it's circular. So where did the DNA come from? We talked about that, was that last week? We already talked about where DNA came from. And Einstein, on Science and Philosophy, said, the man of science is a poor philosopher. In a lot of ways, he was correct. Now, there are some scientists out there who are both scientists and philosophers. But it's important, again, to follow the evidence where it leads. The next argument is the homology that we see in this. Yeah, homology is observable. We can see bones and we know that they are similar. And this is, the top picture is the forelimb of several different animals: dogs, bats, seal, and man. And you can see the tarsals and metatarsals, right, Patty? I forget what the feet and hand difference are. But you can see the similar structure. In the man, it's all up at the front. In the bat, you see it in their wing, but it has the same structure. They also used embryos or embryonic development of different animals. And there was actually, Haeckel was the first one. They called it Haeckel's embryos. And this was in textbooks. He put together a chart. This is not the exact chart, but it's similar to this, the picture that he drew. And it became extremely popular. He didn't actually draw it to be supportive of macroevolution, but Darwinists adopted it and started throwing it into textbooks as proof of macroevolution. And he drew it in the late 1800s, and it's been in textbooks ever since, even though his drawing was fraudulent. He purposely drew the embryos to look more similar than what they actually were. Now, Jonathan Wells from the Discovery Institute, he wrote a book called Icons of Evolution, and he was talking about all the proofs of evolution that they use in textbooks, and they're no longer even accurate, but they still leave them in the textbooks. His book came out in 2000, and Haeckel's embryos, he hit on those. Well, guess what? Shortly after that, they started to disappear from the textbooks. So yay to Jonathan Wells for writing a good book. But they're still in there. There were a lot fewer after the year 2000, but there's still a textbook out there from 2013 that still has it in there. So hopefully it's getting cleaned up. But does similarity in structure prove that macroevolution is true? Just because the teaspoon and the kettle have similar structure doesn't mean they evolved one to the next to the next. No. They created all of those because they served a similar function. And Darwinists would yell, this is not a fair illustration of macroevolution because the teapot and teaspoons are non-living, and we're talking about living things. But it was actually the Darwinists who started using non-living things first to talk about macroevolution. And this is Darwinist Tim Barra. He offered the progression of the Corvette. Any car fans in here? He used the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification. And he said, see, you can look at the 53 Corvette and the 63, and you can see how it improved on certain aspects. And then from the 63 to the 68 and the 68 to the 78. Again, what's the problem with this analogy as an example of macroevolution? This is a design. People designed it. So there was a goal in mind to make it as aerodynamic so it'll be good on gas mileage, all the while keeping it sporty to attract the attention of all the car enthusiasts out there. There was a purpose, and the designer was designing it to meet that purpose and goal. But what we also notice is it started with 4 wheels, and it still has 4 wheels today. Why? Because wheels work the best, and they're not square like the old caveman cartoons. It's now known as Barra's blunder because he was supporting the case for intelligent design. Darwinists say that we know all of Earth's creatures share a common ancestor by way of unguided macroevolutionary processes because of DNA and homology. And how do we know that DNA and homology all point to a common ancestor rather than a common designer? Because macroevolution is true, but that's circular reasoning. It makes a little more sense when we draw it. So they say DNA and homology is proof of a common ancestor. So we ask the question, why couldn't it be proof of a common designer? And they say, because macroevolution is true. And we say, well, how do you know evolution is true? Because of DNA and homology. That's a circular argument, and it becomes meaningless because you're smuggling in your conclusion into your evidence or your premises. So we have that evidence against macroevolution. There's two more lines. We have irreducible complexity and the fossil record. We won't spend much time on irreducible complexity other than I'll explain it. I think I mentioned it previously. Irreducible complexity is any trait or attribute of a organism that all the parts have to be there at the same time in order for that system to be functional. And if any one part is missing, it serves no survival function whatsoever. The best example of that is Michael Behe's the bacterial flagella. It's the little whip-like tail that causes the bacteria to be mobile in your body or in a fluid. And if you look at that bacterial flagellum, it is a rotary motor. Now, it's made up of proteins, but the function of those proteins, there's a drive shaft, there's a rotor, there are stators that hold the rotation in place. There's the hydrogen ions cross a barrier that generates the power for the tail to move and be functional. The problem is that could not have been designed by a gradual process of parts coming together to give you the tail, because they all have to be there for it to be functional. So if they're not all there at one point, and the human eye is like that, it's irreducibly complex, and there are all kinds of systems that are like that. If you read Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, he goes into example after example. Our blood clotting system in our bodies is like that. It's irreducibly complex. And Darwin he understood that. He understood that that could be an argument, and he said if any structure could ever be found that could not be pieced together over time by a gradual process, then basically my theory would completely fall apart. And now we're seeing those all the time now that we can see inside the cell. Now the fossil record it's fascinating because that's the one thing that you see all the time that Darwinists just hang their hat on. The fossil record shows it. The problem is the fossil record actually shows the very opposite of what they're trying to prove. There's a thing called the Cambrian explosion, and it happened now, don't get hung up on the ages and stuff. You can make your own decisions on the age of the Earth. We're using their evidence and their numbers. But approximately 530 million years ago, over a period of 5 to 10 million years, which sounds kind of ironic, but 5 to 10 million years is a blink in geologic time because we're talking about billions of years. Most of the major animal groups or phyla appear in the fossil record abruptly, and there's no fossil precursors to those animals. So you have the Cambrian layer, which is, this is the Cambrian period, so there's several layers. But you have that Cambrian layer, 5 to 10 million years. If you look for fossils below that of precursors to those animal phyla, they're not there. So it's as if they just showed up. And of all those animal phyla, all living things today still fit those same animal phyla that were found in the Cambrian layers. They call it the biological Big Bang. So we have the Big Bang Theory, which is the beginning of the universe, and they call this the biological Big Bang. And this is another thing Darwin was aware of, but he thought, hey, the future, we got a lot of time in the future, just give us more time. The fossil record will be expanded. We're looking for more, we're digging for more, and things will change. And my theory will be supported. However, 160 years have passed, and the picture remains the same. Not saying we don't have a lot more fossils to look at, but there's still nothing below the Cambrian. Richard Dawkins doesn't debate this, and no scientist does debate it. It's the evidence. They know what it's showing. He said the Cambrian strata of rocks are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear in the fossil record. So these are already complex animals. Well, if they're already complex, that blows a hole in a gradual progression. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. He's making he's making our claim, but he's not buying it. Stephen Meyer said it's not just the Cambrian explosion that is striking. It's far from the only explosion of new living forms. The first winged insects, birds, flowering plants, mammals, and many other groups also appear abruptly in the fossil record with no apparent connection to ancestors in the lower older layers of fossil-bearing sedimentary rock. So the picture we're seeing is not, at least in the fossil record, is not one of macroevolutionary theory. So instead of everybody's seen the Darwin tree we kind of put up earlier, the tree of life they call it, and it starts with one animal, single-celled animal, and over time it just progresses into all. We should be looking at a lawn as an analogy rather than a tree, because we see all the blades of grass showing up at once in the Cambrian, and while there's some variation within the blades, we don't see them crossing over to other blades. And when we look at the fossil record, all of this is non-existent. All we have in the fossil record are the nodes or the tips. And that's what they're touting as evidence of common descent. Stephen Jay Gould, who is not a Christian professor or scientist, he said the extreme rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. No matter how reasonable they may be, they're not getting it from the evidence of the fossil record. So Richard Dawkins says, well, if there's no gradualness, we're back to a miracle. That's a strange term. Of course, by miracle, he doesn't mean God did it. He just means we don't have an explanation. We're back to square one. We just lost 160 years of scientific research. That can be a big pill to swallow. National Geographic, remember the article we talked about? They said macroevolution is true, Darwin was right. They had a moment of clarity also. They said, illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames has been lost on the cutting room floor. That's terrible. Can you imagine the movie you would watch if it was missing 999 frames out of 1,000? It'd be a 47-second movie, and you'd be like, what the heck was that? Also, what's their definition of spotty? Missing 999 of 1,000? I'm not sure I agree with their definition of spotty. What would the fossil record look like if creation was true? It would look like what we have. We have events where animal phyla show up at once in the fossil record. So macroevolutionary theory says or shows this, the tree of life. The true picture is this. There's no gradual tree of life. We're not missing the link. We're missing the chain. If 999 links are missing out of the 1,000-link chain, you don't have a chain. Science, don't ever think that there's a complete consensus of scientists and evolution. There's a website called dissentfromdarwinism.org, and if you go there, they have this printable list. You can print it, download it and print it. It's 28 pages of roughly 1,200 scientists from major universities. In order to sign this document, you have to be a PhD, or you have to be a medical doctor who is associated with a college, who is teaching or a professor at a college. And they have to agree to this statement when they sign this. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinism, or Darwinian theory, should be encouraged. They're saying your theory is not working. The mechanism that you're using of random mutation and natural selection is not enough to get the complexity of life that we see today through a slow process of gradualness. In fact, there are even mathematical challenges. Mathematicians are saying, okay, let's evaluate. Let's say how long does, if we get a mutation, how long does that mutation, if it's favorable or provides some kind of survival benefit, how long does it take to get past to the next generation? So they've used actual data, and they're saying even when you use 4.5 billion years for the age of the Earth, not enough time to get to where we are today. So this is not scientific consensus, so don't feel bad when sometimes you feel like an island and people are screaming evolutionary theory and you feel like, I don't believe it, I don't buy it. Because there are a lot of very intelligent people on your side. So if you ever get confronted by someone and they ask you, do you believe in evolution? You should ask them a few questions. Understand when people make claims, we have a tendency to want to defend ourselves immediately. And we want to start spouting off our knowledge of the knowledge of the information or the case. It's not our job to confront and to argue against what they just said. So if they say, I believe in evolution, you don't have to tell them all the reasons evolution is true. You want to find out why. So the first thing you want to ask them is, what do you mean by evolution? They may not even be aware that there's because most people that they get a little information, they get brave, and they just spout off what they've heard, or they just keep repeating memes they've seen, and they don't really know why they believe it. And I will be the first to admit I was that way. Before I ever looked into any apologetics, I had no clue why I believed what I believed. I just believed it. So the first thing you ask, what did you mean by evolution? Because they may not even know there's a difference between micro and macro. So you want to clarify that. Secondly, you can just ask them, how did you come to that conclusion? This is where a lot of times you will get, because they don't really know. But if they do, that's awesome. because they spent some time at least thinking about it. And then when you find out where they're at, you don't want to shadow box. You want to know what they believe before you start talking to them about stuff, because you may be shadow boxing against something that's not even there. So when they explain where they're at, then you can just ask, well, have you ever considered irreducible complexity? Have you ever considered that homologous characteristics could be just as easily explained as a common designer rather than a common ancestor? So you can start asking them questions and let them do all the talking. And just find out where they're at. So there's a great book by Greg Kokel. It's called Tactics. And it's a great tool. It's a book everybody should read because it tells you how to engage with the culture and not be afraid to do it, because you don't have to come up with a bunch of answers. You can just keep asking questions. Tactics by Greg Kokel. I think it's just Kokul. So you can be in charge and you don't even have to know anything. You can just be inquisitive. And if they start asking you questions and you don't know, you just say, you know what, I've never actually given it a thought. I was just kind of curious where you were at. And so you don't have to be afraid to do it, because you can just, wow, that's good information. I'll think about that. So we know truth exists. We have several reasons for why we believe God exists. So we'll come up with our last one next week, which is the moral argument. The moral argument is actually pretty interesting. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a lot of apologists think it's the most convincing of any of the arguments. Not sure I agree, but I do like it because it's at the core of every single person. I hope, other than being a psychopath and having mental problems, nobody's going to say it's okay or it's right to torture little children for fun. So we all know that there are things that are objectively wrong. Not just my opinion, it's wrong for everyone at all times and all places. And if there's just one thing that we can say is objectively wrong, God must exist. And we'll go into that next week. So, any questions from anyone? Chris is always the one with questions.
What is the distance between berserkly and honorary?
The state, I think. That's a Frank Turek quip, so I stole that from him. Any questions? If not, we'll see you next week. And if anybody didn't get handouts, we had a few people that contacted us about handouts from previous weeks. If you want handouts that you didn't get, just let us know and we will get them to you. So thanks for coming out.